In 1995, the movie Hackers hit theaters, following a group of renegade rollerblading teenagers with the ability to make New York City effortlessly bend to their will thanks to their elite computer hacking abilities. This movie is set in a cyberpunk-like universe where computer hackers are capable of causing mass amounts of chaos and destruction due to how many everyday appliances and important services are tied to automatic computer controls or operating systems. What's great about the movie Hackers isn't how it attempted to predict the future. We all know that most, if not all, great cyberpunk media usually attempts to do this to their own degree, only for us to use things like hindsight and afterthought years later to laugh at how unbelievably wrong they were. The greatness in Hackers doesn't appear at any specific time in the movie, though. The greatness is instead shockingly apparent when the movie is already over, and you slowly start to realize this cheesy 90s movie was able to keep your attention for about an hour and 45 minutes somehow. This movie not only proved that Angelina Jolie was a talented actor, with it being her first leading role in a movie ever, but it also proved to the world that a special kind of phenomenon exists and lingers within all of us to an extent, whether we want to admit it or not. And that's the fact that people who don't know how to actually hack think the concept of hacking in itself is pretty fucking cool. In the modern era, technology is at the forefront of nearly everything around you and supports the world in more ways than we can possibly begin to explain in casual conversation. It was only a matter of time before us humans started to create stories or make some kind of artwork that fictionally portrays these tools of great power as something utterly dystopian, if you think about it. The cyberpunk genre of art has been around for decades now, and it seems to only gain more popularity the more we slowly but surely waddle ourselves into the future, more and more, day by day, step by step, yada yada yada. Ubisoft's Watch Dogs, that was released originally for 7th generation consoles back in 2014 if you can believe that, is an open-world action-adventure/crime simulator game set in a near-future fictional version of Chicago. One where a tech company by the name of Bloom controls the entire city through an intricate and hyper-optimized operating system by the name of CTOS. You play as an experienced hacker with somewhat of a Batman obsession called Aiden Pierce. Aiden, or the player, has unlimited access to everything in the city thanks to his ability to hack into the CTOS network, allowing him to access anything and everything around him. This provides the player with a ton of unique interaction and gameplay opportunities that can happen at any time during their playthrough, and it also adds a shit ton of unparalleled gameplay loops. Real talk, this game does a pretty good job of combining mechanisms like stealth, third-person shooting, parkour, and even driving a little bit into one big, excellent demonstration, even if the driving isn't really anything to write home about. Players can do anything from manipulating traffic lights to cause car accidents, peek through security cameras and into people's private text/phone conversations, blow up steam pipes hidden underneath the road, and even disrupt enemy communications with certain skill point investments. Generally speaking, the player has control over most, if not all, the things around them at all times. That is something not every game can claim. Hell, most games released in 2024 don't even give that much free will to players. The more that I think about it, Watch Dogs is also one of the only AAA games that I can think of off the top of my head that decided to make a gimmick like hacking its main focus point. And it's also a gaming franchise that I didn't expect to leave such a lasting impression on me that it has. I mean, if I'm being blunt with you, I've spent the better half of the last 2 weeks bombarding my friends with random questions, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I've bursted into somewhat endless exponential rants or explanations of this game and why I love it, like more than twice to them now, I know. When I first downloaded the first Watch Dogs game, I downloaded it with the intention of replaying it and kind of analyzing it. I didn't think very much of it at the time, nor did I think I would invest this much time into it. I thought I was just jumping headfirst into another one of the thousands of open-world sandbox games that exist out there, and the last thing I expected to find was something noteworthy or interesting, by my own selfish standards anyway. What I found instead, though, might just be the reason why so many people would go as far as to consider this game a masterpiece. I don't necessarily think I would go that far personally, but I can't lie. After playing it for so long, I see where most of these people are coming from when they say that. Watch Dogs is fascinating on a multitude of different ways, but if I were to describe the entire experience I had in one word, with the hopes of sparing you from watching the rest of this video, I would say it was a rather convoluted experience in total, if I'm being honest. Miscellaneous fun is something Watch Dogs will for sure offer you an abundance of, and it will come in a wide variety of ways, there's no doubt about that. The only real complaints I actually have with this game are how it tried to oversimplify things like gameplay mechanics and controls, and of course how tangled the story becomes in the final act, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. Now, don't get me wrong though, I can understand how some situations require some sort of simplification while saying that though. For example, if you think about it from a game developer's standpoint, it makes perfect sense to make the controls somewhat more flexible for new players. There's even an interview the creative director of Watch Dogs, Jonathan Morin, did with the website GameDeveloper.com where he straight up admits that the game wouldn't even work if players couldn't understand the hacking gimmick without much thought. So, in other words, players had to literally be able to control the entire city with the push of one button. That is way easier said than done. Not only is Morin right when he says that, but I actually agree with this sentiment a lot, because I honestly couldn't see myself being forced to learn and then later perform some complicated system of rules just to hack into something as trivial as a security camera to peek around the corner. I didn't find hacking to be very problematic in my playtime, nor do I think fleshing it out would fix any of the problems I actually have with the controls. The issues I do have, however, arise when other aspects of the controls are brought into question. To kinda give you a better idea of where I'm coming from though, later on in that same interview, Morin went on to explain how him and his team took a lot of inspiration from franchises like Saints Row and Grand Theft Auto when developing and designing Watch Dogs, but they also wanted to somehow separate their work from others in one way or another. In my humbled opinion, hacking was more than enough to separate Watch Dogs from other crime simulator games, and the team should have just stopped there, but they didn't, unfortunately. Instead, they decided to redesign the controls in such a way that ties sprinting, accelerating while driving, and shooting all to one specific button, the right trigger for some reason. This doesn't really sound like that big of a deal, I know, but it has the potential for disastrous situations. Like the times when you're sprinting towards an enemy to melee them, but you accidentally mantle over the railing system that was right next to them because both melee attacks and vaulting are also tied to the same button for some reason. Watch Dogs was originally released back in 2014. By that time, GTA 5 had already had a year's worth of time to marinate in gamers' minds, and the Saints Row franchise was already on their 4th installment of that series. What I mean when I say that is, players are obviously more than capable of learning new systems and techniques, but when franchises of such magnitude have already proven what works and what doesn't when it comes to said control systems, it just kinda feels like Watch Dogs tried to reinvent the wheel a little by making so many minute things different from other similar open-world games. For example, there's a reason games like Fortnite and countless others have copied Blizzard's item rarity color format for the last 20 years or so, with gray/green normally being some kind of okay, blue being better, but purple being better than that, and gold normally being the best, yada yada. Obviously not every game has loot systems that uses these same exact colors to indicate the exact same thing, but you get the gist of what I'm saying, I hope. Sometimes, when a system like this has been reinforced into players' minds for years at this point, it's better to just go along with it than trying to make a whole new thing in general, just to redo what those other ones were already doing. I'm okay with shooting and driving being tied to the same button, that's something most games share in common. But sprinting too? Come on, it just feels so unnatural to me for some reason. And reloading with the analog stick? Would I really be going on that much of a limb to suggest some aspect of the controls get implemented in a better way? Another thing I really didn't like about this game was its wanted/notoriety system. It's perfectly normal for crime simulators to have some kind of restrictive, authority-like system that gets onto you when you do things like murder innocent civilians and what have you. Most of the time, these systems automatically apply themselves to the player after the game has detected you've done something deserving of punishment, but that's not necessarily how things work in Watch Dogs. Every time you commit a crime in front of any civilian, they immediately become a witness. Then, depending on what your reputation is in the city, goes to determine whether or not they will call the police on you or let you go. If they did decide to report you, though, then the police will begin to use the CTOS network to triangulate your current location. The game's way of showing this to the player is done by spawning in these massive circles that have the potential of moving multi-directionally, so it doesn't matter where you are on the minimap because they can just go right over you, and they're bigger and faster than you. The goal here is to try to avoid them while a meter in the bottom corner slowly decreases from 100%, but if you stay in the circle long enough, and it actually does reach 100%, then the cops are officially on you. To be frank, this is probably the dumbest way I've ever seen a wanted mechanism be worked into a video game. I respect the notion of not wanting to outright copy the same systems from other games, but I really wish they would've, honestly. Sure, this system is somewhat intricate, and at the very least, it's undoubtedly unique, but I feel like it would have benefited the game a whole lot more to have a more traditional wanted system, like one in GTA. I'm not saying that GTA has the best wanted system known to man. I mean, Red Dead easily out-tops that, but, you know, sometimes less is more, and this is definitely one of those categories. I mean, if I were to be completely honest here, I think the whole system is practically useless and semi-broken anyway if you have somewhat of a high reputation due to how many civilians just don't call the police on you. I'm not even kidding whenever I say that either. This also led to hours of gameplay where I was just driving around doing side missions, solving crimes to boost my reputation, and I didn't encounter the police not even once, for like 2 whole hours. Speaking of which, there's also a vigilante system. It's kind of like an honor/reputation kind of system I've been referencing in Watch Dogs as well for some reason. I don't actually know why the system is in the game though, because no matter what your reputation is, it doesn't affect any outcome of the story whatsoever. It's mainly just a tool to see how the public view Aiden. I like the idea of having a system like this in Watch Dogs, I really do, but when other studios have already implemented similar systems into their games, some that even affect the outcome of the story based on how you acted throughout your playthrough, it just makes the reputation system in Watch Dogs feel like it's kind of useless. All it offers to the game and effectively does is make sure you experience the game in one of 2 ways. A good reputation means you basically never see the cops or face any kind of punishment for your behavior. But if you have a bad reputation, you practically never go a minute without seeing or having to escape the police due to the fact that random people off the street start to recognize you by face, and then alert the police as soon as they see you. Meaning there's no ripe in-between, it's either you see them too damn much or not enough. I know this system isn't the worst thing ever invented or anything like that. I actually like the pedestrian part of it, but they had to go throw those whole big death balls in there too for some reason. In an open world game where causing any form of mischief is not only implied but recommended even, it just seems like an odd way to design a notoriety system to me. The worst part about all that too is the actual police chases themselves through Chicago are probably some of the coolest segments this game has to offer. Seriously, I know I just spent an entire paragraph talking shit about how the wanted system is overly complicated for no reason and all that, but when all that bullshit is actually over and you just have to avoid the police like you would in a GTA game, escaping them is pretty damn fun. The hacking tools make room for some genuinely unique stuff to happen as you speed through the city, like opening a drawbridge that in return acts as a makeshift ramp that boosts you into the air at the same time as it cuts off the however many police cars that were tailing you. Or when you trigger an explosion on any of the steam pipes that are hidden underneath any of the roads. This not only damages the road, but it even has the possibility to take out the police cars that are chasing you. Later advancements into certain skill trees also grant the player the ability to temporarily blind police helicopters that start to tail them after enough notoriety. First for only 15 seconds, but you can even upgrade that to 30 seconds, and I thought this was a great addition. It's a unique way of incorporating the actual choppers themselves into chase sequences in my opinion, because by giving the player another tool to fight back without making them resort to doing something like pulling over and shooting them down like you would in other games, it essentially acts as a perfect example of Watch Dogs succeeding and doing the right thing to separate themselves from their inspiration. If you really think about it, this one choice is enough to separate a GTA chase sequence from a Watch Dogs chase sequence. And I can't help but think this is what the developers thought they were doing by redesigning all the other aspects of this game as well, but some of them just unfortunately fell flat. There's other stuff hacking lets you do too, of course, like opening closed gates and garage doors to have access to back alleys and parking buildings. But after a while, I stopped noticing those little things after I had grown somewhat dependent and accustomed to them, and instead I started to notice how janky and restrictive the driving is in general in this game. And believe me, I really hate saying that too, because no matter how many cool and beautiful cars you come across that just so happen to be parked on the street with utterly breathtaking ray tracing that reflects off the top of them like a special coat of gloss, or how destructible they are when you actually beat them up and every individual part of them easily falls off the more damage they undergo, it doesn't even matter. They all drive like a steaming pile of dog shit. That really starts to suck even more if you were to stop and smell the roses, as they say, like I did, and slowly start to notice how magnificent all the cars in this game actually look. I played the re-released version of Watch Dogs on both PS5 and Xbox Series S for the purposes of this video, and I have to say, I was absolutely taken aback sometimes by how good this game surprisingly looks, especially when it's raining. I know these newer consoles have the capability of processing these games at capacities never before considered, and I know there was a bit of a war about how this game used to look on older consoles, but now that it's 2024 and that war has kind of been put to dust, I hope everybody can just come to the conclusion and accept that this game looks good at the very least. Hell, personally, I'd even say it looks great, but if you were to call it its very worst, it would still be good. Fortunately enough though, the actual gameplay of Watch Dogs feels really smooth. It's almost like a sort of blended mix of games like Far Cry and Sleeping Dogs if I had to compare them to what first comes to mind. The combat itself even allows the player to be a little creative when faced with it too. You can do things like hack into protectors, therefore manipulating the environment to your advantage, so to speak, by making your own cover and even burst steam pipes to instantly comatose any enemies within its initial explosion range. It's not necessarily the most innovative of combat systems out there, but I'd be lying if I were to tell you the combat sequences in this game bored me. I mean, there is a reason I spent nearly 60 hours on this game over the last 3 weeks after all. Players can also activate a type of slow-mo camera sequence similar to ones found in games like GTA, Red Dead, Max Payne, etc., except this time it's called focus. This slow-mo ability is really helpful in the chance that you get detected while sneaking around too. It gives the combat sort of an added layer of depth, but it was already pretty fun without it, I have to admit. The takedowns you can do while sneaking around in this game look so cold and calculated too, I have to add. I'm not normally the kind of guy that gets shocked after witnessing video game brutality either, but I genuinely found the way Aiden just casually unloads a few rounds into these guys, at close range mind you, while he simultaneously watches their limp bodies hit the floor, to be deeply unsettling for some reason. Maybe it's just because of how inhumane and premeditated they all feel, but either way, it just doesn't feel like something someone who is connected to reality would do to somebody else. Only something Aiden Pierce would do, if that makes sense. If you've been paying attention, you've probably already noticed how I've mentioned Aiden Pierce a few times now, but I haven't actually analyzed anything about him or his character yet. The main reason for this is because I wanted to replay the story of Watch Dogs a second time just to see if there's any previous opinions of mine that have changed, or to see if I've missed anything. And boy, I'm so glad I decided to do that because I missed a lot of things, and my opinions of this game overall have changed significantly since then. When I first saw Aiden, I thought the same thing that 95% of all the audiences who played this game thought, and that was, oh brother, do I really have to spend a whole campaign playing as a knockoff Batman wannabe dumbass? At first, I did not like Aiden or his vigilante persona, mainly because of how full of himself he is in almost every cutscene, but after a while, I'm not gonna lie, he kinda started to grow on me. To my surprise, his character does actually have a bit of nuance to it, but most of these defining characteristics don't get properly showcased to the player because of how many other plot points in the story drown them out. I really do think Aiden could have been a really interesting anti-hero type of character, but instead it feels like the game doesn't really let him shine until the latter half of the story. The game starts out as Aiden and his mentor Damian Brinks are attempting to hack into a high-class hotel called the Merlant, with the intention of siphoning as many bank accounts as possible undetected. It doesn't really work out like that, of course, but this introduction cutscene stuck out to me and I wanted to point it out because of how well it uses these specific cliches of beloved hacker movies in order to set the tone for Watch Dogs. I know this scene is mainly here to introduce the characters to the players at home and to help define what their motives are and whatnot, but the whole thing just looks and feels like the intro to a Hollywood-level movie, both visually and tone. I'd even go as far as to say the cinematography work Watch Dogs demonstrates is honestly on par with most of the actual movies being made today, and this is something I rarely ever see the game getting credit for. Sometimes placing a camera in a very specific angle can add so much depth to the scene itself and to the message it was trying to portray as well, and I'm glad Watch Dogs knows that too. This whole beginning montage kind of jumps around the timeline a little, but it doesn't leave out the important stuff. To spare you the time, long story short, Aiden got tracked after that little Merlant stunt, because this is a hacking game after all, you know, and this results in his 6-year-old niece, Leanna Pierce, being murdered by a few fixers in a car crash, therefore giving him a justifiable origin story / reason to turn into the vigilante he becomes later in the game, or whatever. Before I go any further though, I guess I should address that word I just used. The term fixer gets thrown around a lot throughout the course of this game, and all it basically means is some kind of hitman / gangster. I don't really know why the game chose to make up a whole new terminology just with the intent of referring to an archetype of nameless bad guy that already existed, but if there's one thing this game is good at, it's thinking that it somehow rediscovered fire. The main reason I bring up all of these little things and I'm harping on them in such great detail is because of the way Watch Dogs just throws all of this information at the player, instead of using Act 1 to properly set up these events and explain them in more detail. Instead, all of this character growth that Aiden supposedly went through happens in literal seconds. As 1 second he's in that fatal car crash with his niece, then the next he's staring at her grave, you know, as you do, then a few more seconds go by later, and he's already tracked down her killer and is actively psychologically torturing him under a stadium in Chicago. Like, yeah, it's pretty cool to witness all of this as the player because it showcases Aiden's power he's displaying, but it would have been a hell of a lot cooler and more meaningful to me if I had to do all of these things myself. The game starts out with all the opportunity in the world to tell a hefty, slow-paced, narrative-driven prologue, and instead it's gone in actual seconds, gutted like a deer in September, and I don't even know why. The only thing Act 1 is actually good for, though, is giving the players at home some kind of sick power fantasy to perform insane stunts like breaking into prison and waving around unloaded guns. All the while they're equipped with nothing but a face mask, nightstick, and indestructible cell phone. One of the many things that stuck out to me and made Batman genuinely unique as a character was mainly the fact that Bruce Wayne was more of the mask that Batman wore. Later depictions of Batman don't seem to focus too heavily on this aspect of his character, but one thing I always took away from his story was that Batman was capable of handling the scenarios he found himself in, not because of his toolset or utility belt, but rather because of his strength, endurance, and raw willpower. Bruce Wayne may have been the one who fell into that bat-infested cave under Wayne Manor when he was 9 years old, but Batman was the one who came back out and rebuilt it into the Batcave. Sure, his tools have been depicted as ridiculous as things like shark repellent before, but the main goal is it was never really the tools that made Batman the man he is. The same things cannot be said about Aiden Pierce whatsoever. I would even go as far as to say that Aiden isn't even Aiden without his cell phone and police baton. Aiden is a psychological manipulator, going as far as to target literally everyone he encounters, even his own family at times. He constantly acts out in selfish nature, and it usually, if not always, results in someone experiencing some kind of unfortunate event they didn't really sign up for, and his attitude alone is probably more than enough to make you think he's a dick if I'm being honest. It really kinda sucks when you lay it all out like that too, coming from a place of liking Aiden. The whole vigilante side of him is pretty dull, I have to admit, but I think the way he hides his true emotions and thoughts from everyone, including the player sometimes, to be very interesting, and it is a very thought-provoking way to deal with the identity of a protagonist in my opinion. Man, he really had all the potential in the world to be a completely unique take on the whole masked vigilante trope, but instead it feels like his whole character design kinda just fell flat somewhere along the lines of its creation, and we just got stuck with this version of him. He's still got some nuance to him here and there, I have to admit, and he still shines in those certain moments in the story, but I can't help but feel like he was destined to be more somehow. All the stones are almost in the right places for him to be unique, distinctive, and an intriguing anti-hero type of character, but he just drops the ball more times than not. I don't know how else to put it. No matter what happens, Aiden Pierce handles every situation in his own self-serving, vindictive kind of way, and the player usually never has any say about it whatsoever, despite Aiden's reputation being one of the many things the players actually are in charge of. The entire first act is basically just a disguised tutorial, meant to help teach new players the ropes, and there's nothing wrong with that of course, but for that reason it is very lackluster in terms of events. The only important things that matter to the overarching plot that take place are as follows. Aiden and his good pal Jordy kidnap Maurice, the man who killed Aiden's niece in the prologue cutscene, and keep him for further questioning/torture. Jordy might just be my favorite character in the entire game, solely based on how little of a fuck he gives about everything else that happens around him. Watch Dogs is kinda buried underneath this thick, tension-filled, heavy, dark tone, and I often found Jordy to be somewhat of a comic relief type of character due to how much he doesn't abide by this tone or respect it in any way that the other characters do. His overall personality is a strict contradiction to the one of Aiden's, and due to this particular clash, I believe the duo bring out the best in each other, and oftentimes, I found that the most memorable moments I had while playing this game happened to be when Aiden and Jordy were working together. It's a shame they don't do it that often, though. Even his betrayal at the end of the game kinda feels like he's only there to deliver a middle finger to the plot, and to say I told you so one last time to Aiden one way or another. And the fact that this also doesn't affect the story in any major way too makes it very difficult for me to actually hate him like I think the developers wanted me to. Another mission in Act 1 that is mainly meant to introduce fixer contracts to the player also introduces one of the main villains. At the end of the mission, as you slowly creep up into a dark alley, Aiden gets to meet Lucky Quinn, who is a notorious mob kingpin who basically runs the entire city of Chicago, but none of that is outright disclosed to the player at first. There's another mission called Big Brother that happens to be a metaphorical play on words that I thought was pretty clever, showcasing how Aiden reestablishes contact with his little sister Nikki and her son/Aiden's nephew Jax. Aiden also eventually meets Bad Boy 17 too, a hacker he's been working with for a little over a year now, but this name will probably come as a surprise to the player. To Aiden's surprise, however, Bad Boy 17 is not bad at all, or is she an actual boy. Her real name is Clara Lyle, and she's not 17 either, I guess I should say. This is why you should never trust online usernames or expect them to somehow resemble their real-life counterparts of human beings. This would have been a clever reveal to players if it wasn't for the fact that nobody past the year of 2005 have actually fallen victim to such a stupid fiasco in real life. But Watch Dogs thought they did something clever here, so let's let them have their moment, I guess. Aiden's surprise doesn't last forever though, and none of this newfound information stops him from using intimidation tactics on her. This scene, if any, should do a good enough job of showcasing to you how little Aiden actually values the others that are around him. This poor girl has never met him before, and has supposedly only offered him nothing but help so far, and yet he still chooses to harass and diminish her, in an attempt to manually extract whatever it is he wants out of this scenario. Whatever that may be, we'll never know I guess, because we're the players, you know, we're not Aiden Pierce. One big problem I have with Aiden's character itself is that he's always trying to seem better than everyone around him and is constantly making an effort to outthink them. These characteristics on their own aren't necessarily enough to make anyone a bad character, but when everyone around him is constantly pulling the rug out from underneath him as he acts like this total badass, it kinda just turns these identifiable features of his character and makes them feel more hinders to them than they are helpful. Even characters like Clara see right through this fake bulletproof persona he wears and poke fun at how predictable and immature he is constantly throughout the game. None of it really ends up mattering that much though, because one way or another, Aiden always gets the upper hand on them because he is a master manipulator at the end of the day, never once actually facing or accepting any kind of retaliation / accountability for his own behavior. Even some of his good friends like Jordy take the time to point out how idiotic and downright ridiculous most of his plans are. But oftentimes they still stick around for most of them anyway because they like having a good time, I guess. I don't know, it doesn't really make any sense. Like that time Aiden got himself thrown into prison just to prove a point. This probably sounds like I'm joking or like I'm trying to take the piss out of the actual plot, but I shit you not. This is a canon event that actually happens at the end of the first act, I swear to God. As it turns out, one of those thugs Aiden dealt with under the stadium in the first mission didn't actually die, and now he has a chance to testify against Aiden in court. So, Aiden thinks the most optimal way of dealing with this problem is getting himself incarcerated just so that he could prove to this guy that he can, and I quote, reach him no matter where he is. The following steps in this plan cause for him to get arrested, all of his items confiscated, going through great lengths to smuggle his cell phone into prison walls, and then you can finally search for your target. First off, I don't think there's a single court system located anywhere in the entire US that would incarcerate and imprison someone that fast, but for the narrative, I'll digress. Another noteworthy part of this mission is when Aiden just decides to outright be a creepy stalker. In order for him to sneak into the prison, he has to find a prison guard, trace down their next of kin, and then snoop around until he finds their whereabouts. In this case, it was the guard's niece, and he did it through a phone call. Actions like this paint him in a very cruel, sadistic, and unrealistic kind of way, and needless to say, it doesn't help him relate to anyone at home either, I'd argue. Thankfully, the vulnerability of his character among many other things as well get discussed in far greater detail in the next coming acts, though. At the beginning of Act 2, Aiden tries to re-establish contact with his old pal/mentor Damien Brinks, the guy from the first cutscene if you don't remember. Aiden has second thoughts about teaming up with him at first, but before he can voice his opinion to him, Damien reveals that he's already kidnapped Aiden's sister, Nikki, and he doesn't plan on giving her back until Aiden jumps through a few metaphorical hoops for him. This is more than enough narrative weight to hold over the players' heads in order to keep them somewhat invested in the story because of how we already have gotten to know Nikki somewhat during the first act. I actually believe it adds a new layer of depth to the story, one that contributes significantly to the narrative structure, and it's mainly the reason that kept me pushing through the story. I really wanted to know how this was going to play out, I'm not gonna lie. And if you're wondering that same thing, well, you're gonna be wondering that for a while, like I was too, man. Earlier I said this game was very convoluted, and this is what I mean by that statement. Not only does Aiden have to jump through a rigorous amount of undisclosed hoops for Damien, but he also has to jump through about 100 more just for Nikki. The plot of Watch Dogs branches off into a whole lot more places before it circles back to wrap up this major plot point, and I honestly wouldn't even complain about that if it only happened once or twice, but it seems to happen with every single key element of Watch Dogs' story. I don't know what it is about it, but every little plot point has the tendency to break out and start telling its own story within a story, especially in the final act. Take the whole side plot with Bedbug, for example. Later on in the second act, Aiden is tasked with finding an IP address for Damien, and when he finally does find it, he discovers that it belongs to a server room located inside some Viceroy territory, and the only way inside is through this guy named Iraq due to a special kind of key he possesses. Viceroys are one of the only gangs that seem to operate in Chicago for some reason, but then again, that doesn't really matter because even they take orders from Lucky Quinn. The only thing that matters to Aiden right now, though, is getting close to Iraq, and players are about to see how far Aiden is willing to go just to get what he wants. It might even be safe to say that most players couldn't even predict it if they had to. So, if you guessed Aiden's next course of action would be to blackmail and then peer pressure his next of kin into helping him break into that server room, you'd be correct, but if you guessed anything else, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to go home. Believe it or not, I am being dead serious here. The next few missions, I shit you not, revolve around Aiden stalking and gathering enough blackmail on Iraq's cousin Tyrone, with his street name being Bedbug. Now, it doesn't take 20/20 vision to see that Bedbug is a young kid who is undoubtedly in over his head here. He seems way too innocent to be involved in all this gang drama, but at the same time, he's still young and kind of lost in life currently, Therefore, his admiration for his cousin Iraq's success in the gang world has probably led him to think that he could do the same thing for himself. So he's kinda just been helping out when he can, climbing the ranks, meanwhile trying to build a name for himself in the process. Aiden figures all this shit out and still has little to no sympathy for Bedbug's situation, and one could honestly even argue that he makes it worse. Despite knowing how young he is, and even acknowledging how ruthless Iraq is. For whatever reason, he still chooses to disregard the future of Bedbug's relationships and his well-being even, by sending him inside Iraq's bunker, alone with a body cam, giving him strict orders to follow along the way. This obviously doesn't end well for Aiden or Bedbug, as Iraq and his goons eventually come busting in, catches Bedbug red-handed, and feels so betrayed that he even starts to hold Bedbug out of a nearby window. And for a moment it is even implied that he does throw him out of the window, but that almost immediately gets shot down as Bedbug calls Aiden and confirms that he's still alive not even 2 seconds later. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's cool that Bedbug got to live and all, but I really feel like his death could have been used to teach Aiden that his actions have consequences and they affect the people around him way more than he thinks. But instead, by them allowing him to live, that kind of gets rid of any of the lasting tension that has been building up these last few missions, and it totally crushes any chance of guilt players at home like me were feeling at the moment. Not only to mention that it doesn't really do anything other than reinforce Aiden's narcissistic behavior either, and nobody likes that. I mean, hell, most of us already know that Aiden will probably even use this event to justify his actions further down the road somewhere when he's acting equally as shitty in a different spot. The two even have a friendly chat on the phone with Aiden telling Bedbug that he did a good job when everything's said and done, and I just kept thinking, how? What did he do correctly? He was being blackmailed and stalked by someone he's never met, and definitely feared for his life in more ways than one. He probably just acted on impulse, and if we're all being honest with each other, he got lucky. Aiden was the farthest thing from help to this poor kid, so I don't understand how these two could just have a happy-go-lucky conversation with each other after everything that just went down not even 10 minutes ago. There's another time in Act 2 where Aiden's actions get brought into question, and this time it seems like they actually affect him somewhat. At some point, Jax runs off and Aiden has to go find him. When he does find him, he just happens to be surrounded by a bunch of bad guys. Aiden then proceeds to single-handedly take out every armed guard that stands in the way of him and his nephew, and for the most part this mission seems pretty simple, but there's actually a unique kind of twist to it. As it turns out, Jax was taking refuge in the camera room of this building and got to witness firsthand his uncle murder the fuck out of every one of these random people. This obviously freaks Jack out like it would any normal human, and he's genuinely terrified of Aiden for a little bit. This whole mission is probably the most realistic one in the entire game, honestly, just because of how people start to look at Aiden differently. Jax doesn't want to deal with his bullshit anymore, and neither does his therapist, who threatens to call the police on Aiden if he doesn't start explaining things soon. And if you were expecting Aiden to have some kind of redemption arc or whatever after he contemplates his actions here, I hate to tell you, but it doesn't happen. I don't know why they set it up perfectly, but it just doesn't happen. This could have been the perfect opportunity, and I mean absolutely the perfect opportunity, to integrate stealth into the story a little more, and it would be a perfect time to start punishing players for taking people out lethally instead of non-lethally. But before you go getting any big ideas now, let's not kid ourselves. The developers themselves even said they don't trust the players with pushing more than one button. So do you really think they're gonna let this much narrative weight fall onto the players' shoulders so easily? The answer is no, unfortunately. The other big driving point of Act 2 is the auction. The game tries to play coy with the player at first, but slowly it eventually gets revealed that the auction isn't your typical run-of-the-mill kind of auction. Instead, it's a huge front for a human trafficking operation that's taking place in the center of Chicago under everybody's noses, with a high number of elites and corrupted police officers in attendance. The whole human trafficking thing kind of rubs me the wrong way because I feel like this plot point was shoehorned in just to give us something to relate with Aiden with. I mean, seriously, be honest with yourself for 1 second. Is there actually anything other than the dislike of human trafficking that you and Aiden Pierce share in common? I literally can't think of one other fucking thing to relate to this man with. I'm pretty confident you don't need me to tell you this, but human trafficking is undeniably one of the worst crimes, and unfortunately, it's one of the most frequent in big cities like Chicago. So I don't understand why Watch Dogs chose to throw this subplot into the story, if they were just going to use it as an overblown spectacle while Aiden technically has more important matters at hand. He does end up freeing Poppy, which is cool, I guess, don't get me wrong. But if he was a true vigilante and actually cared about this situation half as much as he says he does, he would drop this self-righteous revenge bullshit he's on and put a stop to the whole underground ring right here and right now. I mean, who is really stopping him other than himself, let's be real. Aiden is unbelievably selfish here and is only here to get a copy of Iraq's key. If you want to know how the whole human trafficking fiasco plays out, it's considered to be side content for some reason. Fast forwarding through the story a little though, at the end of the act, at one point, Clara tells Aiden that even if he manages to make it inside of Iraq's base and somehow gets his hands on the data, neither of one of them would be able to decrypt it either way. So Clara suggests that the two of them try to find the infamous Ray Kinney. So that's exactly what you set off to do. Act 3 consists of Aiden looking for Ray and asking for his help, but it doesn't go down that smoothly. Aiden finds him in a bar on the outskirts of Chicago, and at first the two get into a fist fight, but eventually they settle down and strike a deal with each other to help each other out over the next few missions, and this leads to their relationship growing stronger. Plus, this gives players at home another chance to find out more about the legendary Raymond Kinney. To kind of set the scene, the reason so many hackers in the Watch Dogs universe idolize Raymond Kinney is because he's responsible for the Great Blackout of '03, as the game refers to it as. You see, years ago, Ray actually worked for Bloom as a software engineer, and over time, he grew more and more suspicious and paranoid over how much control Bloom had over all the major cities, specifically taking a huge issue with their action prevention algorithms, and due to how vocal he eventually became about these issues, Bloom ended up letting him go. So, in an act of rage and an effort to warn the rest of the public and show them the truth of what was really going on behind Bloom's closed doors, Ray caused a massive citywide blackout to show everyone how vulnerable these systems really were, and to show them that Bloom didn't really care. They were just using these systems to gather information on the public the whole time. Unfortunately though, this massive blackout caused the death of 11 civilians in its crossfire. Now, 11 people aren't that much in the greater scheme of things if we're talking about casualties, but Ray didn't expect anyone to die over his antics, so this hit him pretty hard. And to make things worse, the city of Chicago didn't think twice before labeling this warning as a targeted attack, going as far as to brand him as a cyber terrorist even though his intentions were sincere. That's why Aiden finds him hiding out so far in the country, away from the actual city of Chicago. This backstory alone is enough for me to like Ray way more than Aiden if I'm being honest, even if Ray is just a glorified Edward Snowden. Again, this kind of just goes back to that argument I made earlier where I said this game had all the potential in the world to tell an interesting story, but it chose to tell a cliché revenge one instead for some reason. I really don't understand. T-Bone's whole story gets wrapped up in over the course of like 5 or 6 missions in total, if that. But one-off side villains like Iraq get upwards to 2 whole acts worth of time before their stories meet their respected conclusions. Truth be told, I don't even think Iraq is a bad villain at all. I actually respected how little of a fuck he gave about Aiden, and I liked how he had his own motives that weren't even on Aiden's radar. The problem I do have with him, though, is the fact that his headquarters, known as the Rose Formant, gets reused more than any other building in the entire game. I mean, seriously, you have to break into this motherfucker so much. Ironically enough, there's even a shocking amount of dialogue dedicated to how impregnable this building supposedly is. But when Aiden says, "Alright, enough is enough, I'm going in," absolutely nothing stops him from John Wicking his way all the way up to the door single-handedly. Which begs the question, why did Aiden waste so much time toying around with Bedbug when he could have just cut the bullshit out of the way and did this from the get-go? I mean, it really makes no sense, and if anything, it only delayed Nikki's rescue by an entire act if we're being honest. When Aiden meets face-to-face with Iraq for a second time, he learns that Iraq was the other hacker who hacked into the Merlant with him and Damien back in the intro cutscene. Iraq's whole plan is still somewhat unclear to Aiden, but pieces are falling into place, and there's obviously something highly important in that data that Iraq has because he's willing to sacrifice his entire life to protect it. What follows next is a kind of rudimentary level of a boss fight. It starts out with a kind of 2-minute long back and forth between Aiden and Iraq, but eventually Iraq shows himself and him and Aiden go face to face, 1v1. Unfortunately for him though, Aiden is kind of the protagonist and whatnot, so therefore he wins effortlessly, leading to Iraq's dreams and ambitions getting shot down right then and there. After Iraq is dead, Aiden finally gets a chance to download and sift through all of his data, and to his surprise, What he finds is enough blackmail to hold the entire city hostage, which is exactly what Iraq was planning on doing as a way of rebelling against Lucky Quinn, his boss. It doesn't take a genius to see that Iraq and Quinn don't necessarily see eye to eye, so I actually liked the idea of him planning to eventually overthrow Quinn a lot. I'd even go as far as to say it's probably some of the most realistic writing in the entire game, because everything Iraq does fits perfectly within the lines of his motives, based on his previous actions, of course, and it probably would have happened if it wasn't for Aiden butting his head in between everything, honestly. Almost immediately after the boss fight with Iraq, when Aiden gets back to T-Bone and Clara, a hacker that wears a rat mask and goes by the name of Default infiltrates the gang's systems, steals all the data Aiden just got from Iraq, erases it, and then installs a virus onto their computers. Literally couldn't have done a bigger fuck you to them if he tried. At first I thought the hacker Default was some kind of nod or a reference to the actual real-life hacker that goes by the name of Default. You know, the one that deleted like $9 million worth of student loan debt a few years back. But then after giving it a little bit more thought, I remembered this game came out back in 2014, and that was way before that incident ever occurred. Still a cool coincidence though, I suppose. If you haven't heard that story though, I highly recommend that you look into it. I mean, seriously, the amount of stuff that guy was able to pull off is definitely on the Watch Dogs level of bizarre and unworldly. The next few missions revolve around Aiden and the gang searching for Default in order to get their data back, and I have to say, the chase sequence with him as he's controlling the CTOS system instead of you made for a few memorable moments. I actually liked it a lot when Watch Dogs flipped the script like this, because in a way it allows for the chase sequences to feel a lot more unpredictable and reaction dependent than they used to. Which is something they've never felt like previously when you could easily use these tools to your advantage by opening up any and every shortcut known to man. There's another mission that takes place shortly after this that has Damien turning the CTOS system against the player again, and then makes them escape a 5-star wanted level that plays out just as cool in my opinion. A few minutes before that chase sequence actually happens, though, Aiden convinces Damien to let him call Nikki, and Aiden uses this opportunity to trace down her location with the help of T-Bone. In Aiden's process of rescuing Nikki, she ends up taking a guard's life by accidentally shooting him in the throat, and she reacts in just about the same way a normal person would if they were in her situation, honestly. I really liked how realistic this game can take itself sometimes, even if the only two characters that actually do this are Nikki and Clara from time to time. After Aiden saves Nikki, he gathers her and Jack and tells them to start a new life somewhere, and what that results in is probably one of the most goddamn gut-wrenching cutscenes in this entire video game. Nikki is literally standing, begging to be a part of Aiden's life, and he's just like, sorry sis, can't do that, I gotta be the vigilante or the fox or whatever the fuck, I'm sure you understand. This entire scene is very emotional and very hard to watch. It would have been harder to watch, though, if Nikki hadn't just figured out that Aiden was the vigilante on the car ride over here. Seriously, I don't even know what the writers were thinking when they wrote that part of the story. The news has broadcasted multiple times now that Aiden Pierce is the vigilante. They've given his full name, and there's even an arrest warrant out for him. How the fuck has Nikki not heard about this, or has she not figured it out until, like, right now? That isn't even the only plot hole in Nikki's side of the story either. Jack's therapist has been threatening to call the police on Aiden if she doesn't hear from Nikki, but as soon as Nikki comes back, we don't see her anymore, and Jax is conveniently located back at Nikki's house for some reason. The only other time his therapist makes another appearance is at the end of the game on the credits, just to announce that she's writing a book about her experiences with Aiden, and honestly, good for her. That doesn't even sound that unrealistic, but it is kind of anticlimactic in the greater scheme of things. And not like calling the police would have done anything anyway, but still. Around the end of Act 4 is where the plot begins to get really messy in my opinion, but things don't start out all that bad though. At some point, T-Bone calls Aiden and reveals to him that Lucky Quinn was the one who called the hit on him and is responsible for Lena's death. Which is something Aiden probably should have suspected by now since Lucky Quinn owns the Merlant, but who am I to nitpick? What follows next is a sort of full circle moment where the plot is mostly revealed to the player, and it's obvious Aiden has to face his demons by returning to the same hotel from the intro, the Merlant. Except this time it's to finish things once and for all. Aiden takes advantage of the fact that Lucky Quinn is hosting a charity event and uses this opportunity to infiltrate the Merlant once again, only to eventually discover that Lucky Quinn is hiding inside of a hidden bunker-like room on one of the top floors, totally encased in a wall of bulletproof glass. He openly mocks Aiden for coming all this way just to fail and suggests he turns around right now and leave while he still can. And what happens next is probably one of the most morally questionable affairs I've ever had to perform in a video game. You see, Lucky Quinn had heart surgery recently, which caused a pacemaker to be implanted in his heart as protocol. Once Aiden discovers this, however, he instantly hacks his way into Lucky's pacemaker and starts shit-talking this old man while he slowly accelerates the speed of his heart. This has by far got to be one of the most goddamn cruel and lamentable ways I've ever killed someone in a video game before. I don't care what you say, it is so fucking sad to see an old man crumble right in front of you. Even if that old man is a mob boss criminal piece of shit, there's no way around it. This is ultimately where the story resolves itself too. As Lucky Quinn lays on the ground, dying, he explains to Aiden the real reason he called that hit on him at the beginning of the game. When Aiden and Damien originally hacked into the Merlant, Lucky had thought they were trying to steal the video of the mayor killing a girl named Rose Washington. Lucky was using this video to blackmail/control the mayor and the whole city in the process, so he couldn't risk anything happening to it. Therefore, that's why he ordered the hit on Aiden's family. After Quinn tells Aiden this, he doesn't last much longer. Almost immediately after his death, Aiden then stares over his corpse and mutters something along the lines of, "I thought I would feel empty after doing this, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I finally felt awake." Which is genuinely one of the most shocking and disturbing things you can say after killing a man, in my opinion. To be completely honest, I would have been perfectly fine if Watch Dogs had ended right here. Aiden has officially avenged Lena, he's got his family in a safer place, and hell, he's even cleaned up the streets of Chicago a decent bit by this point somewhat. Unfortunately, Watch Dogs doesn't end here though, and what follows next is a whole chase sequence where Aiden must race to save Clara, who is just throwing herself into harm's way for no good reason whatsoever. I'm being dead serious too. The game doesn't even give you 5 seconds to take in all the stuff that just happened with Lucky. It just piles this extra Clara bullshit in at the end of the same mission you just killed Lucky in. It's honestly ridiculous, and it kinda spoils the reward you get for taking down one of the main antagonists, if I'm being honest. Apparently, Clara felt really guilty for being somewhat responsible for Lena's death, so she went out of her way to contact Damien as a way to offer herself up as a trade for Aiden's sister. Clara didn't even know Aiden already rescued her, but Damien doesn't really give a fuck about any of that. He uses this moment to show Aiden how evil he is and sends a bunch of henchmen to kill Clara instead, who is coincidentally standing over Lena's grave for some reason. I really have no explanation for this event and why it had to play out at Lena's grave, other than the fact the developers thought that it might be a little bit more depressing or something. I really don't know. I would have been more than okay with not having to play this part of the story, honestly, because this is where the whole plot kinda starts to go downhill for no apparent reason. Remember in Act 2 when Damien's whole purpose of kidnapping Aiden's sister was to help him find/get revenge on the ones who wronged him and Aiden? Well, Aiden finds Lucky Quinn, and that whole situation never gets brought up to the two ever again. Instead, Damien's whole agenda changes for some reason in the literal final act of the game, and his new goal is to cripple the entire city so they know what it feels like too. I probably wouldn't have had such a problem with this motive if it didn't just come out of nowhere. The entire final act is just filled with a ton of convoluting plot points that never even have the chance of getting more attention, and I don't know why that is. Take DedSec for example. There are tons of audio logs out there that reference them in some way or another, and they constantly interrupt news broadcasts to warn the public with some kind of message. But they don't get used in the actual plot until the final fucking mission of the game. And when they finally do make an entrance, they appear seconds before Aiden is about to shut down CTOS, and they say something like, "We can be your watchdogs, Aiden." Which is the first and last time that name ever gets used in the narrative in any way, just for Aiden to shut them down and say something like, "Nah, sorry, I work alone, pal," and hangs up on them. Why was this elite group of hackers wasted in such a shameful magnitude? They too had all the potential in the world to be at least somewhat interesting. Hell, they could probably even carry the whole plot single-handedly if they had to. Thank God they make somewhat of a comeback in the second game and prove this point, or I'd be even more pissed than I already am right now. After Aiden denounces DedSec, he hacks into a nearby orbiting satellite using Bloom's control center and causes another citywide Chicago blackout, one that is on par with the one Ray/T-Bone caused back in 2003. Now, here's where things get a little tricky. This was supposedly justified within the narrative somehow because it was used with the intention of locking Damien out of the CTOS network. But doesn't that still leave a lot of room for casualties? Like for people on life support systems and stuff like that? I understand this is technically the one good thing Aiden ever does, but the game never really clarifies what happens here because it's the last mission, I guess. Although Watch Dogs made a very clear effort to articulate that 11 people did actually die back in 2003 when this happened to the player earlier, both in the main game and even far greater in the DLC. But for some reason, the casualties of Aiden's blackout don't ever get brought up in this game for some reason, unless my dumbass just missed it somewhere, and that is always possible, you know. While the city is in a state of chaos, though, Aiden uses this opportunity to track down Damien, who he finds is taking refuge at an abandoned lighthouse for some reason, and then the two finally meet face to face after all this time. In the movie Hackers, there's a moment where the antagonist, the Plague, and the protagonist, Crash Override, are face to face with each other, and the antagonist takes the time to say this to his rival. Quote, "We are hackers. For us, there's no such thing as friends or family. We operate as our own countries, with temporary allies and temporary enemies." End quote. The way Damien Branks was written reminds me a lot of Fisher Stevens' character, the Plague, but he is nowhere near as thought out to that layer of degree, and that's really saying something because the Plague was half comic relief and half sinister villain. I don't really know why the game doesn't give Damien a chance to at least explain himself here. I mean, it's the literal peak of the climax after all. I know his motives have technically already been revealed to the player, but he doesn't get a chance to say anything else of importance when the two see each other on the top of this lighthouse. The game has been building up to this moment for hours at this point, just for Aiden's good old pal Jordy to swoop in out of nowhere and betray Aiden for money or whatever the fuck, totally ruining the whole fucking climax in the process. There is legitimately one line of dialogue in the whole game that is dedicated to foreshadowing this moment from happening, and I don't even think it's really necessary for the plot if I'm being all that honest, not only to mention you could totally skip over it if you're just not paying attention to the phone calls. It doesn't take very long at all for Aiden to get the upper hand on both Damien and Jordy, then he shoots Damien in the head and says something like, "I wish I knew what he was thinking in those final moments," and yeah, I do too, goddammit. Jordy ruined that whole fucking scene just to give Aiden a phone call almost immediately afterwards, rekindling their friendship, after everything that just happened, and Aiden's just like, "Yeah, that Jordy, am I right? Ain't he something else?" The only actual good or semi-interesting part of the ending is right before the credits start, when Aiden is giving his "thanks for playing the game" monologue. "I don't look back anymore. I don't regret," he says. "I look forward. Everything is connected, and I will use that to expose, to protect, and if necessary, to punish." End quote. It might not be the most original thing ever said in a video game, but I liked it because it means Aiden is finally addressing his true power to some degree, and it's honestly kinda scary. Aiden is openly admitting to the player that he is going to operate as judge, jury, and executioner from now on, until he sees fit. In Dragon Ball Z, when Goku unlocks the ability to transform into a Super Saiyan for the first time, he tells his son Gohan to get as far away from him as possible before he powers up and loses what little bit of reason he has left, essentially turning his mind off and becoming one of the most ultimate fighters the universe has ever seen. The difference between Goku and Aiden Pierce, though, is that Goku only uses his powers when it is absolutely necessary. He did only go Super Saiyan as a form of defeating Frieza at the end of the Namek Saga after all. Aiden, on the other hand, is abusing and flexing his power now just because he can. The only two people he cares about are out of harm's way now, so he's basically allowed himself to power up, quote-unquote, in his mind, and he's also using that info as a sort of justification for his actions as well. Aiden's turning point as a character also proves the whole Batman quote that says you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain in the process. If you remember, back in the second act, Aiden mocks Lucky Quinn for flexing his power at the auction, but is he really doing anything different right now? He's killed people, hurt people, and caused just as much heartache as Lucky Quinn did to him if we're being honest. I mean, every one of the goons you take down in this game has a family, right? Despite everything else about it, this is the one part of the ending I thought was actually kind of creative, even if it's just answering a comic book quote from 20 years ago. Much like the ending of the fourth act, I would have been more than satisfied if the game had wrapped itself up here after that Aiden quote, but instead, you get a chance to wrap up loose ends, so to speak, about midway through the credit sequence for some reason. The camera slowly pans into a room with Maurice sitting on a chair. visibly shaken and openly distraught. And Aiden gets to make one final decision before the game is over. Do you kill or spare the guy that killed your niece? The first time I played the story, I actually just shot the poor bastard because I felt bad about everything Aiden and Jordy had put him through. I mean, the motherfucker can't even count to 4 correctly anymore. It's just a sad sight to see in general, if I'm being frank. After exploring the map a little more, though, and discovering a series of audio confessions Maurice had left behind, I found out he was actually just some kind of patsy in some big operation, and a point is made that him and Aiden aren't that different from each other, due to how Maurice's family was being held hostage and later killed as well. In my second playthrough, however, I let him live because I felt even worse for him after discovering this tragic backstory of his, and when I did, Aiden just leaves him in that dirty garage and drives off into the sunset, saying something like, "Now we both get a second chance." And I just kept thinking, yeah, Maurice is getting a second chance, that's good, but why does Aiden get a second chance after all this? He may not have killed Maurice, but he still definitely murked all those other bad guys during the runtime of this campaign. And not even to mention, that whole statement completely contradicts the endgame monologue he literally gave not even 10 fucking minutes ago. By a great deal, too. This version of the ending just paints Aiden as some kind of narcissistic hypocrite, and for that reason, I think the technical bad ending, where you just straight up pop a cap in Maurice, is the actual good ending, due to how it doesn't contradict any of the writing. It still doesn't paint Aiden in the best of lights, I know, but I can personally accept the version of Aiden that is a lot more honest with himself about how dangerous he is, a whole lot easier than I can the version of him that constantly tries to justify his own narcissistic actions, oftentimes by weighing them all out on some kind of psychological scale. So, if I had so many problems with this game's story and even the way the game controls to an extent, why did I play it for so long? Long enough to make a 12,000 word plus video about it even. And to that I say, because I don't really know. It wasn't all that bad if I'm being honest, nor would I count this game as being one of the worst I've ever played. I actually liked the hacking puzzles / minigames a lot, along with the actual minigames themselves too. Did you know that some of the Watch Dogs minigames even have their own skill trees that are unique to them and only available while playing that specific minigame? Because I sure as hell didn't. I made it to about 92.5% on the progression tracker before I even knew most of these little minigames existed, and it just goes to show how the developers wanted to make as many unusual ways for players to interact in Chicago with as possible. The Spider Tank mode is a nice nod to the various mayhem modes from franchises like Saints Row, and it gives players a similar taste of that chaotic sandbox those kinds of modes usually offer. I also thought both the Alone and the Madness modes were oddly satisfying to say the least. The Alone mode uses stealth in all the right ways to encapsulate an intense feeling of fear within the player, and the nail is further driven down by weakening the player's damage output and weapon selection. The Madness mode is a unique take on driving minigames too. You're actually encouraged to run over pedestrians here GTA 1 style instead of being penalized like you would in the main game. It's basically just the video game representation of junk food. And it's just a whole lot of mindless fun, nothing else needs to be said really. The whole concept of digital trips in general kind of caught my eye with the way it is interwoven into this game through its own in-game world building. Not only are they just a hub for minigames, but they also get introduced to the player as a new kind of drug that's recently been sweeping the streets of Chicago. You even appear to be taking something and passing out before every one of these minigames actually start too. There wasn't a real reason or need for this or any of this to be in the game really, but I liked how much effort the game put in to explain why these things are here. Another thing I liked about this game was its open world. It might not be as big as games like Just Cause or Grand Theft Auto, but Ubisoft is usually really good at fleshing out these realistic depictions of real-life places, and Watch Dogs' Chicago is a key example of this. I know there was a lot of fuss over how the graphics looked back in 2014 when this game originally released because it was technically marketed as a next-gen title, meaning it had to look nothing less than crisp and it had to compete with games like GTA 5 from its launch. But now that that whole debate has been put to rest and newer consoles can display this game at even better quality than previously imagined, I think this game does truly deserve to be called marvelous. The water around Chicago has no right to look that good, and the inclusion of historical places that are actually in the real-life version of Chicago was another feature that I really liked. At the end of the day, Watch Dogs is a video game. I wouldn't say it's one of the best out there, but at the same time I wouldn't go as far as to say it's one of the worst either. Watch Dogs is a fine 6.5 or 7 out of 10 in my books. I'm not even normally the kind of guy that likes to use such an arbitrary IGN level of ranking system to define what he thinks about video games either, but I also don't really know any other way to accurately describe to you listening right now that I think this game is the perfect depiction of mediocre. There's nothing wrong with that either. I know a lot of people are probably racing down to the comments to shit on me for saying that already, but believe it or not, I actually like a lot of mediocre games and movies and just media in general myself. I mean, hell, I watched the movie Hackers before I wrote the script if you couldn't tell. If you're looking for a semi-decent gaming experience, and I really mean semi-decent, you will 100% find it in Watch Dogs. This game certainly has the capability to satisfy the human brain for at least a few hours. Maybe even more than that if you're listening to a podcast or music or whatever else. Truth be told though, I actually liked Watch Dogs so much that I purchased the $10 Bad Blood DLC because I was still kind of thirsty for some more hacking shenanigans, even well after I'd already beaten Aiden's story, believe it or not, and I wasn't too dissatisfied with my purchase, honestly. One of the biggest issues I had with the main game was how Aiden's story got the center spotlight. Meanwhile, plotlines like DedSec, Ray Kinney, and human trafficking were forced to take the back seat, so to speak. So if anything, it felt like this DLC was the answer to everything I was complaining about. Aiden is quite literally ripped out of the plot, and he is the only part of the base game that doesn't return in this DLC in some kind of nuanced way. He's still in the DLC, of course, but only in phone calls and fox hunts, which is the name of the special kind of side mission dedicated to him. I really liked T-Bone as a character, and I grew quite attached to him during the runtime of the main campaign, so I didn't really mind spending a few more hours running around this fictional version of Chicago with new stuff to do with him at all. And I really do mean a few hours whenever I say that too. Seriously, I know the whole DLC is only $10, but you could literally beat the entire story in one night or about 6 hours. But just because it's short in terms of story, that doesn't necessarily mean the story itself is bad in any way. It's obvious the main focus point of this DLC was to give players an ungodly amount of side content, but I'm glad to say that the story didn't get any less attention to it due to that. The side content of this DLC itself, though, does feel genuinely endless, and it encourages replay value by tying online leaderboards to them that reward the players with some generous stuff. These leaderboards are kinda overly complicated, I have to admit, but they are still active in 2024 at the time of writing this, and they're more than capable of rewarding you with a lot of tokens and money. I was debating on whether or not I was going to bring up tokens, because the only thing you can really get with them is outfits for T-Bone, but if you didn't know they existed, now you do, I guess. They're nothing special. The story part of Bad Blood is actually really good, though. It takes place 1 year after the events of the main game, and it uses every bit of its runtime to flesh out these characters that everyone already somewhat knew, like Tobias in Default, for example. Players encounter Tobias in Aiden's story a few times, but his character gets way more attention than he ever did here, opposed to the main game. His struggle with addiction is properly addressed with far greater detail here too, instead of Aiden just calling him a nutcase and assuming he's high all the time, which is another aspect of his story that I really liked. He even overcomes his addiction thanks to the help of T-Bone too, but that doesn't happen till near the end of the story. The hacker Default from Act 4 of the base game also makes another comeback in this DLC, but this time it's pretty obvious that far more thought has been put into his intention, and he plays more of a villain role than ever. In Aiden's story, it didn't really make a lot of sense why Default hacked into the gang's computers just to expose Clara out of nowhere. He kinda just shows up. But in Bad Blood, you can actually find a few audio tapes lying around that reveal Default and Clara knew each other, and some even show how Clara was trying to help him get into DedSec, but it all went to shit somehow and he vowed revenge. This DLC also attempts to flesh out DedSec a little more by revealing that the group is being led by a group called the Council of Daves, which in reality is just a bundle of like 5 dudes who all go by a variation of the name Dave. I'm not entirely sure what is trying to be said here, in all honesty. At first I thought it was like a Dread Pirate Roberts situation where multiple dudes go under the same name to keep the one anonymous, but I still don't really know why that's trying to be said. I'm just glad it's not the last illustration of DedSec we get to see, though. I also thought the reason Default hates Ray Kinney was a clever twist on the whole whistleblower story too that's been mentioned a few times now. You see, when T-Bone caused the blackout back in 2003, he was only trying to warn the world by sending them a message, but it did cost 11 people their lives. We've all heard that story a lot by now. One of those 11 people, however, happened to be Default's brother, which is new info. And this is the reason that Default has been hunting Ray for so long. Normally, I don't like it when a DLC reuses an old villain from the main game. I think it's cheap from both a writing and a development standpoint. But Watch Dogs does such a great job of retelling these characters' stories that I genuinely didn't mind seeing them again that much this time around. I even got pretty invested in the whole rivalry between Default and T-Bone. And I found the ending of the DLC where the two try to gas each other to death to be somewhat fascinating and mildly entertaining. It may not be the most thoughtful of endings when it comes to video games, but neither was the main game's ending for that matter. Default's death and his overall story arc was mainly about Ray moving on, metaphorically. Now that Default is gone and Tobias is okay, there's really nothing else keeping Ray here in Chicago. And that's how you conclude a story and leave enough room to be written into a sequel, baby. Just because the story is over, it doesn't mean the DLC is over, though. T-Bone / the player still have a shit ton of side objectives they have to complete, and hacking puzzles to solve if they want to see everything this DLC truly has to offer. This DLC also adapts on the co-op system a little by adding a feature that allows players to team up with each other in order to tackle gang hideouts or free roam as they like. This feature is actually really cool, and the co-op in this game is super fun, don't get me wrong. But I can't help but feel like the incorporation of this function also led to every single side mission being littered with enemies. I'm assuming this was done in an effort or with the intent of catering to 2 players, but it kinda just ruins them all, honestly, if you're playing solo. Some side missions feel like absolute bullshit due to the sheer volume of enemies that gets thrown at the player. If you thought the base game provided you with a ton of John Wick moments, well, this DLC is about to give you 10 times more than you ever could have imagined possible. The online multiplayer of Watch Dogs was also something that stuck out to me as well, because it essentially acts like no other multiplayer game I've ever interacted with. I've played a lot of stealth games where the main goal was to blend into the environment and take somebody out, but I've never played one that made me blend into the environment just to see how another person interacts with technology. When you invade a player's world in Watch Dogs, it is done in a very similar way that games like Dark Souls do it. You're basically treated like a glorified NPC. Upon invasion, you spawn in as a random NPC, giving you the ability to blend in with other NPCs on the streets or roads, etc. And your main goal is to just fuck with the other guy. Even though this concept is pretty bare-bone and essentially asking you to cyberstalk someone, I'd be lying if I told you it didn't lead to some pretty interesting and comical gameplay scenarios between me and other random people online. Watch Dogs is a game that released to immense expectations with the visions of blending open-world exploration and hacking mechanics into one big experience. While it may not have lived up to the initial hype that was marketed, it undoubtedly left its mark on the gaming world by offering something new and fresh with its interesting take on urban warfare, surveillance, and themes of control. This game doesn't really deserve most of the criticism it got, in my opinion. I mean, it's not completely undeserving of criticism either, but most of the actual critical comments that were made about this game around the release date don't even hold weight anymore. If there's one thing that remains unmistakably present today in Watch Dogs, it's that this game had an uncanny amount of ambition. Flaws aside, you can't ignore that Watch Dogs put on an excellent display of courage, while also being more than willing to experiment with new ideas and techniques never seen before in open-world games. No matter how you look at it, this is commendable in my opinion, and these characteristics alone would be more than enough to make Watch Dogs stand out significantly if it were released in today's gaming world. Seriously, how many games can you think of that were released this year from a AAA studio that were completely original, have a unique atmosphere, and also experiment in some major way, one way or another? Ultimately, Watch Dogs left me with one question. What happens when technology knows you better than you do? It's a question that feels more relevant today than it ever has before, thanks to things like artificial intelligence advancing more and more every day, and it also kind of makes Watch Dogs stand out as an artifact of its time. More than anything, though, Watch Dogs is a starting point. A stark reminder that innovation often comes from taking risks, and even imperfect beginnings can lead to something greater. And maybe that might be the most important thing you can take away from Watch Dogs. When a game isn't flawless, and it still manages to make you question the world around you, even if it's in a minute way, it's done something truly meaningful in my opinion. Thanks for watching.